Hi, I'm Heather Buzick. I'm a research scientist in the Center for Validity Research at ETS. My research focuses mainly on test takers with disabilities, and in the past few years I've been doing a lot of research on measuring growth, both for school accountability and teacher accountability. And as Lynn had mentioned, we've been sort of talking about these issues for a few years now. I think last year when I spoke, I talked mostly about the challenges that we were thinking about and the research questions. Today I'm going to review that a little bit and then actually talk about some of the research that we're doing in terms of measuring teacher effectiveness with individual student scores. I'm going to follow that at the end with taking those student scores, linking them to teachers, and then trying to evaluate teacher evaluation programs. And as Mary will probably mention, we do have a paper coming out that talks more about those issues where we're back to thinking about the challenges and what are the types of research questions. So just briefly, I'm going to talk about the definition, the technical definition of value-added modeling, just to sort of start us, and then talk about some of the technical challenges, and then move to the research. So value-added modeling is a statistical approach that attempts to isolate contributions of particular teachers to student performance. And it attempts to control for factors beyond the teacher's control. So that's one of the major pros about this method, is that we can actually try to measure causal contributions for certain teachers. It also attempts to control for sorting of teachers and students into schools. So one might think, well, I have a lot of low-performing students in my class. That may not be fair to evaluate me relative to another teacher who has a lot of high-performing students. And so in the best situation, the value-added model can control for that and put those teachers on level playing field. And it's just important to note that many different models can be specified as value-added. So sort of in summary, the pros of this method are that you get objective and quantifiable scores that are comparable across schools and districts. However, there are a lot of drawbacks to this, which I'm not going to go into a lot of them for the general education students, but I'm just going to say that the technical limitations really diminish support for valid inferences about teacher effectiveness. I will talk specifically about some challenges related to using test scores from students with disabilities. So the kinds of research and policy questions that I've been thinking about and we on the panel have been talking about, there's really two main categories. The first one is, should scores from students with disabilities be included in teacher value added? And I see this as sort of coming from two perspectives. The first one is face validity, where what we want to do is improve outcomes for students with disabilities, and one way to do that would be to evaluate teachers, and therefore we would want their scores included in the models, so we get a sense of teachers are being held accountable for educating all of their students, including students with disabilities. However, on the other hand, we have to consider the consequential validity. So there's been plenty of research that suggests that there are threats to the validity of scores for students with disabilities, and including those in the models, we may not be making the appropriate inferences about teachers. So we also want to think about what are the technical challenges and some solutions, which I'll talk about. And then the second research and policy question is, how should the scores from students with disabilities be included? So I'm going to talk about that in terms of modeling, and then we also want to think about how that translates into policy. So just, I want to talk a little bit about the technical challenges, as I had mentioned. And the first one, which I've been talking about a lot, so if you came to see us last year, I know we mentioned this, is inconsistent accommodation use across years. And I've found with my research on different states that this is associated with the measured growth. For example, two types of accommodations that have been shown to increase test scores: read aloud and extra time, particularly with that. So for example, if students don't receive an accommodation last year, but then they do this year, they're more likely to look like they're growing because they're getting that score boost from the accommodation. Alternatively, if they got the accommodation last year and didn't get it this year, they're going to look like their growth is lower or perhaps even negative. And so the question is this due to the teacher or is this due to the situation with the accommodations? Excuse me. A second technical challenge is that the performance of students with disabilities on average tends to be low. And this is a problem where the state assessments, for example, are not getting precise measurements of students' abilities, and therefore we're not going to be doing a good job of measuring their growth. A third problem is that the number of tested students for special education teachers is often too low. And here we're talking about students who take the general assessment. So teachers may have 1 or 2 or 3 students with disabilities who are receiving special education services taking the general assessment, or we may have a special educator who has a few students in their class who are taking the general assessment, and we may not be able to get a value-added score for them. Time spent with the teacher is another issue that we have to think about. So students may be in a co-teaching situation where they're taught by both the general ed and special ed teacher, or they may be in pull-out situations where they spend a portion of the time with each. Who does the value-added score get attributed to in that case? And then finally, alternate assessment scores in most cases cannot be used in value-added modeling. So here we have a bunch of students who are taking the alternate assessment, and their teachers are not going to have the value-added scores. So I'm just going to go through an example of the types of research that we're currently doing. This is data from one state, and I should mention that my colleague Nate and I have a paper that's going to be coming out that describes this some more, so if you'd like it, you can email me. This graph here, if you look at the bars, it shows the relative standard gains. So in other words, for each of these groups, which I'll go through, it shows how the groups are growing on average compared to the state. So for the group all the way to the left, as I mentioned before, that's students who got the accommodation in the current year but not in the previous year. And in this we can see that the bars are high and positive. So in other words, these students are in fact showing more growth than the average. If you move over one to the left, that's the opposite situation, where students are getting an accommodation in the previous year and none in the current year. Their bars are negative, which means that their growth is less than the average of the state. And then you can see the other two groups that are consistent, their averages are, their growth is about average. So there is this relationship here, and we have to decide what we're going to do about that. So there's a lot of numbers on this slide here. Basically what I wanted to show is that we're comparing 5 different types of models. The top one, SGPs, are student growth percentiles. I won't go into the definitions, but just the fact that there are several models here. And then we have a bunch of different value-added models. What we've called VAM2B and VAM3, those are the models that include variables related to students with disabilities. So accommodation use and special education status. Now the numbers here in the boxes represent average percentile rankings of teachers. So on average, we want to see all these numbers to be about 50. Excuse me. Because that shows that teachers are performing average. And what you can see here, if you look at the last column, that's teachers with only special education students in their class. If you don't account for variables related to special education, those teachers look like they're performing a lot worse on average. So you see values in the 20s. But once you control for that, looking at the one that I highlighted in red, then you see that performance is about average. So the question is, from a policy perspective, why should we assume that teachers educating special education students are low performing? If we think that that's not true, then we should include those variables in the model. Okay, so just extending this on to teacher preparation programs. Thank you. There is limited research with special education teachers and students with disabilities, and we're hoping to sort of start contributing to that research. But some of the thoughts that we've been having are, one, that some of the challenges that I listed for individual teachers can be mitigated in the aggregate. So by taking multiple teachers that have gone out to the workforce, aggregating them back to their teacher preparation program, and then getting the value-added scores. However, some of these problems likely contribute to more within-program variation, so that's going to make the estimation difficult. And then finally, we probably think that, just as in the case with the teachers, the individual teachers, like I just showed you, that the model does in fact matter. And so we'll have to think about what model that we want to use and what are the related outcomes for that. Okay, thank you.